We now know how prosecutors say the husband and father accused of strangling his wife to death and killing their unborn child escaped to Italy weeks before he was set to stand trial. How Lee Gilley was able to get halfway across the world, considering what he's accused of, is nothing short of ridiculous. And now he's facing new federal charges, and just wait until I tell you the alleged fake name he used to allegedly escape and what his high-profile attorney is telling us. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Lee Gilley was slated to go on trial May 29th. It is shocking that a man accused of what he is accused of was allowed to sleep in his own bed since he posted bond in October of 2024. And the conditions of that bond did not do enough to make sure that he wouldn't flee. And not just to one country, but to two. This is a picture of Gilley with his wife, Christa. He allegedly strangled her to death in October of 2024 inside their home. Court documents say he was the one who called 911 just before midnight, and he allegedly told paramedics that Christa had OD'd. Doctors say they found alleged evidence that this mom, who was 9 weeks pregnant at the time of her death, was strangled. A big update overnight is that authorities in Houston appear to have executed a new search warrant at Gilley's house in the wake of him fleeing to Italy. Now, before we get back to the case that Gilley is going to face when he gets back to the United States, I want to talk about the situation that we have going on in Europe right now where Gilley is detained. So this is a new federal criminal complaint. It was just filed this week after Italian authorities took Gilley into custody in Milan at the airport. U.S. authorities are now charging him with a count of interstate flight to avoid prosecution. And here's the new information that the federal government is alleging. They say that Gilley took an Air Canada flight from Toronto to Milan, specifically AC 894. That is an Air Canada flight that regularly goes from Toronto through Montreal and then to Milan, Italy. That flight landed on May 3rd. Now, it is unclear how Gilley was able to get from Texas to Canada. As part of his bond, he had to wear a GPS monitor, and now he is accused of cutting that off. Now, I want you to try to make sense of this timeline with us. Texas authorities say on Friday, May 1st at around 9 p.m., they get a notice that Gilley's GPS monitor had a strap tamper alert. They write that they tried to contact Gilley, but they didn't hear from him as of May 4th. That is the following Monday. And by that point, he was already in Italy. Now, this is something that does raise a lot of questions because Gilley is not just facing a misdemeanor. He is facing a charge of capital murder for allegedly killing his wife and unborn child. And authorities seem to not know where he was for roughly 2 or 3 days, according to the federal government. And during that time, he was able to make it across the border into Canada and then across the Atlantic to Milan. Now, according to the federal complaint, the Gulf Coast Violent Offenders Task Force, that includes members of the U.S. Marshals, they didn't start their investigation into finding Gilley until May 4th. Gilley allegedly landed in Italy on May 3rd. And apparently the identification that he was using might have passed the test to get into Canada and to board that flight to Italy. But once he got to the airport in Milan, it just didn't look legit to Italian authorities. They say the name that he allegedly used was Lejeune Jan Luc Olivier, and he reportedly had a Belgian passport and Belgian documents. The Italian authorities, though, say those documents, they were fake, they were forged. Now, Gilley was denied entry to Italy, and he was taken into custody, and at that point, apparently Gilley allegedly came clean, said what his real name was, and that he was awaiting trial in the United States for allegedly killing his wife. Now, Gilley has claimed asylum in Italy. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Interpol in Rome alerted authorities in Washington on May 4th. Now, Gilley does have a high-profile defense attorney, and that attorney is standing by his client. I'll tell you what he's saying about all of this in just a moment. But before we get to that, I want to talk about what this all means for the case that Gilley is facing here in the United States. So this is a picture of Lee when he married Christa in 2017. The couple had 2 children, according to Christa's family. Their 3rd child was on the way at the time of her death.
As you know, we're a software consultancy, and I just went through the process of helping a friend select a software vendor.
So this is a video we found of Lee on his old LinkedIn page, just to give you an idea of how this man presented himself and how he sounded as this businessman who worked in the software industry. But prosecutors seem prepared to present a very different picture of who he is when he goes on trial. Just a couple of weeks ago, prosecutors filed a document laying out some of the anecdotes that they may include in witness testimony at trial. Prosecutors say in March of 2024, roughly 6 months before Christa's death, Lee allegedly posted on Reddit that he was, quote, bored in his marriage and wanted a college-aged female for a friends with benefits arrangement. Then October 7th, that is the day of Christa's alleged murder. Prosecutors say that Lee bought a new Kia Telluride SUV without her allegedly knowing. It was later that night that he called 911 saying that she had OD'd. Now, the day before that, so we're on October 6th, prosecutors say that two friends saw Lee at a local bar in Houston where he was acting odd. Those friends say that Lee called his own young son a derogatory term for people who are gay. Then a day before that, family members were at a party with Lee, and they also were saying he was acting distant and he was acting odd. Then on October 8th, so this is the day after Christa's murder, prosecutors say that Lee claimed he was allegedly being, quote, set up and that he was being targeted. He claimed that he needed to leave the country, prosecutors say, and he claimed he needed to do it to take care of himself. Then on the 10th, so a couple days after Christa was allegedly murdered, Lee talked about leaving the Houston area, saying that he wanted to go back to his native South Carolina. And he said he wanted to go back to South Carolina on the 12th. That is the same day that he was arrested and charged by police with Christa's murder. Prosecutors also say that Lee would not let his kids speak to Christa's family. But perhaps the most damning anecdote that prosecutors have laid out is what they say he did back in 2023, because prosecutors are alleging back then that Lee had an affair with a woman in San Diego. Then prosecutors allege between April and May of 2025, so this is as he's out on bond and accused of killing his pregnant wife, Lee contacted the same woman that he allegedly had an affair with, and prosecutors say that he talked with her about plans to flee to Mexico and other parts of the world. Lee allegedly said that he could remove his GPS monitor, and he also reportedly talked to this alleged mistress about marriage to get a new identity, and he asked this woman if she knew of a Mexican identity that he could acquire to help get him out of the country. Now, it is important to note that the same month that prosecutors say this communication was happening on multiple online platforms, a Harris County grand jury indicted Lee Gilley on that charge of capital murder in the death of his wife and unborn child. Now, it's interesting that Lee flew to Italy. That country will not allow extradition of someone who is facing the possibility of being put to death. Now, we don't know if that is specifically the reason why Lee Gilley flew to Italy, and even though he is facing that charge of capital murder, prosecutors haven't said whether they are going for the death penalty in this case. Now, you might be wondering, how is someone accused of killing his wife and unborn child with his two other children in the home, by the way, allowed to be out on bond as they await a trial on capital murder? Now, this is video of Lee making his first court appearance after his arrest in 2024 per KHOU television. The judge set Lee's bond at $1 million. Now, that is a lot of money for most people, but for Lee Gilley, he was able to post it with the surety bond. Now, before I tell you how Lee's attorney is responding to his client allegedly sprinting to Europe ahead of a trial, I want to introduce you to who his attorney is. His name is Dick DeGuerin.
I'm glad you have a mask on.
All right, so we're both on the floor. My left elbow's on the floor. My right hand's on the gun.
Now, that is DeGuerin in his defense of a man named Robert Durst, who you may remember from the true crime documentary that was on HBO called The Jinx. Now, in this scene, DeGuerin played out what his client said happened as his client allegedly wrestled a gun from his neighbor, Morris Black. Durst pleaded guilty to dismembering Black, but was acquitted of murder because of a lack of forensic evidence. Now, on the night that Christa died, prosecutors say that Lee admitted that the two of them were arguing. Records also show that Lee said that his wife didn't have a history of drug use or a history of being suicidal. KPRC says that Lee's attorney plans to argue that Christa died of a pre-existing condition expedition. Now, DeGuerin filed a motion last month requesting that statements that Lee allegedly made on the night that Christa died be thrown out. DeGuerin claims that his client was handcuffed and interrogated, but never read his Miranda rights. In the wake of Lee's flight to Italy, DeGuerin told us that he has yet to speak with his client overseas, but he is trying to get in touch with him. And he told KPRC television that he doesn't find it surprising that Lee would face this new federal charge. And he also said, since Gilley was not technically admitted to Italy, he was stopped at the customs checkpoint at the airport. He believes that the extradition process could actually move quickly and potentially he could return to the United States to stand trial, which is scheduled, according to court records, on May 29th. DeGuerin also said he doesn't believe that his client fleeing to Europe shows any consciousness of guilt. He said that he believes that his client was scared. Now, Christa's family and friends, they have been rallying support for her on social media as this story has received national attention, going all the way back to that terrible night in 2024 where Christa and her unborn child lost their lives. Now, Christa was a proud graduate of Clemson University. She was loved by many, and the Justice for Christa social media pages made a post that said, quote, "We are following the breaking news out of criminal court today. We are devastated. We are terrified. We are processing. Please be patient with us as we continue to navigate this never-ending nightmare." Joining us now to talk more about this case is Jack Rice, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, and a former CIA officer. So great person to have about this. What stands out to you about how Lee Gilley was able to get not just to Italy, but he had to go through Canada to get there? It's incredible.
Yeah, there's so many pieces to this, Chris, because if we think about it, it's not just him cutting off his ankle bracelet. That's one piece. How did he do that? How long did it take for authorities in Texas to notice that? That's one question. The next question is, how do you get from Texas to Canada and you're actually moving from Toronto to Montreal? How are you doing that? And then even before we get there, how does he get a fake Belgian passport and then try to work his way to Milan? We know that this involves not just Texas authorities. We know this involves the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We know this involves Milan and the Italian authorities, but it also involves Interpol in Rome, Interpol in Washington, D.C., so that it's multifaceted.
Well, and the thing too, like I think about flying internationally, and I feel like they check your passport multiple times even to get on the plane. And like now it's like scanning in a lot of cases. It's not like they're just looking at your passport, stamping and moving on. Like there's a scanning process that perhaps like a boarding agent would do. And like somehow he was able to get on this flight. The other part of it that stood out to me were the dates. So May 1st, there's something wrong with the ankle monitor. May 3rd, he lands in Italy. And then on May 4th is when the task force is triggered, which includes the U.S. Marshals to try to find him. How does that work where you would think with what he's accused of, the second the ankle monitor goes off, that they would be on it trying to figure out where he is?
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, I've had this happen in my career where I've had ankle bracelets fail. And so what happens is they'll fail sometimes in terms of the connection between where my client had been and authorities. And so what does that mean? What is the reasonable response? If there have been problems in the past, sometimes what they'll do is they'll make the call and wait. If it sits on a Friday, who does the oversight over the weekend? It may seem obvious, but it isn't always obvious. Sometimes you see that human error and that space that somebody can run the seam. And that's exactly what he chose to do in a case like this. The fact that it took 4 days is a long time, and that is unreasonable. And somebody should have had their eyes on this. When this goes south, the answer will be, you will be out of phone within a minute. You will be out of phone within 10 minutes. You will be out of phone within an hour. But anything beyond that number, and we're going to send the marshals after you. And so the fact that they didn't do that really highlights, I think, a mistake on Texas authorities' parts. One of the interesting aspects of this case to me is they originally set bail at $1 million. Mm-hmm. And so that was the intention in a case like this. There are some jurisdictions that actually don't release people and don't have to release people with bail amounts and with conditions. They don't actually do that. Now, where I am, they're required to. It's actually a constitutional requirement that they have to set a bail amount. And yet at the same time, there are certainly obligations that authorities have if they're going to conditionally release somebody. Because remember, it's not just about them standing trial and facing the potential consequences of a charge. It's also the concern that this person could have and the threat that this person could pose to citizens in Texas or in, frankly, Canada or, frankly, in Milan. That's the bigger question that I think people have to remember.
And his bond certainly has now been revoked for, when he gets back to the United States. Interpol was part of this, and they end up getting, I guess, on the third, Italian authorities at the Milan airport are like, something is not right with this passport. And then he comes clean. He's claiming asylum. And then Interpol ends up calling Interpol in Washington. And then that's kind of how this story came to be. How does that work? Like the process, this person who is, and he admitted apparently, allegedly, that he is on trial or expected to be on trial for murder, but he's claiming asylum. How does that work? That then eventually word gets back. And what a phone call that must have been for prosecutors in Harris County. You get the phone call and it's like, hey, we have him in Milan. How does that whole situation work out?
Yeah, the first thing is when you get calls in Texas, the answer is, boy, did we screw up.
Yeah,
and it did. Now, let's talk about Interpol just in general. We can talk about passports, and you referenced it earlier in our conversation, this idea of just how sophisticated passports are, the idea of being able to get a passport. In this particular case, he had to actually give his American passport to authorities to be released. This wasn't an American passport. He actually, when it was able to get a fake Belgian passport, but and I'm going to go a little bit deeper into my intelligence background here. If you notice, he had other documents as well. Now, sometimes what we used to call that was litter. And we would call it litter because what that would mean is you would say, oh, well, I've got this and I've got this and I've got this. It might be a driver's license. It might be my my AAA card. It might be a receipt from a local diner. It may have something else that's actually in my wallet to say, oh, that's really strange. I've been having some problems with my passport. And you got to remember, passports are sophisticated, not just American passports. Really, every passport, the Europeans in particular, have very complex passports. It's not just about using different kind of lighting. They're looking for certain traps that they place in those passports. I mean, I can tell you, I was in Italy within the last couple of weeks, and what has happened to me before is I've been pulled aside in, in the Netherlands, Stockholm, Paris, Prague, in the last couple of years because they're saying, your face is too fat. Well, that was COVID, and I thought that wasn't very kind of them.
We've all been there, yeah.
Yeah, but that was actually true. And so the point being is it's not just the traps that are placed inside those passports. What they're looking for is all of the paperwork to be consistent, but they're also looking specifically at the person, and they're looking at the behavior. And one of the things that you get training for when you're dealing with DHS, Department of Homeland Security here, but you're dealing with it on an international scale, is that they're looking for behavior that is inconsistent. And so that's one of the things that he was working on. Clearly, when they said other documents, he convinced somebody in Toronto, he convinced somebody in Montreal that he was close enough and there must have been some sort of a problem. But this also established, should that be enough? No, but it does. But back to your original question, is the issue of Interpol. Interpol is a fascinating organization because it wasn't based here. It's an international organization. It was started about 110 years ago. And what happened is it's actually based out of Lyon. But what they've done is they've created these interconnections between really every country. And it really highlights the fact that there is an interagency and an international organizational approach to problems like this. And it really highlights just how important it is. I mean, I can take you to a simple case like Ted Bundy, right? Remember the serial killer. The problem that happened with the Ted Bundy case inside the United States was that even then, we weren't getting cooperation and communication between jurisdictions. So within the state of Washington, within Wyoming, within Idaho, within Florida, things would happen and nobody would be able to get to anybody else. And nobody knew what was going on. Well, they realized that was a problem. just like what we've seen with Interpol. And so in this case, when there was something triggered in Canada, it went to Interpol. And then what it did is it went to Rome because they knew he was flying to Milan. And so what we have was that interconnection that made sure when something goes south, when something does not work, you get the connection. Hence, Interpol in Rome reached out to Interpol in Washington, D.C., looking for an American citizen because they thought, this is what we think this is. So it was that connection, that international cooperation, which I think is so critical and really amazing when you're talking about dealing with international crime or dealing with those who might be on the run from charges, whether they be from Texas or from New York, or whether they're from Paris or from Copenhagen.
Well, and when it comes to, also there were some documents, and this was before he allegedly fled, where authorities or the prosecutors put in a documents, there's some anecdotes that they were going to have at trial, which was slated to begin May 29th. We'll see if that actually happens. And the day after his wife dies, he said he allegedly talked about leaving the country. They accuse him of having an affair in 2023. And then speaking to that woman, they say he spoke to her in 2025 about potentially looking for an ID in Mexico. So this is someone who was already out on bond, which you typically don't see in capital cases, able to sleep in your own bed at night, even with the GPS. And then he's having these conversations. Is that something, like, are you allowed to have those conversations? I mean, if you're the authorities and you're saying, hey, this guy's talking about leaving the country, but he hasn't done it yet, that almost adds to how ridiculous it is he was able to get out of the country, because it shouldn't necessarily, I mean, I know we're like looking at this in hindsight, reading a document, but like, it seems like this was the guy that was thinking about it for a long time.
Yeah, that this really adds to the threat too, doesn't it? And the real problem that comes with that, though, is if we think about his conditions of release, what was it that he was obligated to do? He was supposed to stay in contact. He was supposed to remain law-abiding, and he was supposed to do other certain things. Well, the problem that happens sometimes when someone is released, of course, is that if you're doing something that isn't a crime, but it certainly highlights this issue, what it can do is it may be admissible when it comes to the underlying charge, but it doesn't necessarily rise to the level where you're saying that you violated your conditions of release. The real problem, of course, is his behavior very clearly highlights a potential increase in the amount to flee. Now, actually, as I think about that question, one of the things that can happen is that you can set bail in a case, and a judge can set a bail in a case. But if conditions change, you have the ability to take it back to the judge and ask the judge to either decrease or increase bail, depending upon which side you're on, and say, the conditions have changed from when we originally set bail. So for instance, if what you get is something in 2025 that says he's trying to find a fake passport in Mexico, or he's planning to leave for Mexico, frankly, prosecutors in Texas could have taken this back to the court and said, you know what, we're asking for an increased bail, or we're asking that you keep him in custody because he is an even larger flight risk than we thought, and this is a capital case.
Dick DeGuerin is his attorney, high-profile defense attorney. A lot of people remember him from the Robert Durst trial, and he's got a lot of other high-profile clients. When I've been to arraignments, and we've all seen them, certainly, you do them all the time. You always hear the defense attorney say, trying to get your client a good bail. It's like, maybe he doesn't have a criminal record. He has ties to the community. In this case, he was able to secure a pretty good situation, it seems, for his client, who then ends up being able to go home, but is on this GPS monitor. When something like this happens, does the court look bad on the defense attorney? Like, going back to reading your, you said he was going to show up. And then in this case, it's a little bit of a dramatic case where he goes to Europe. How does that, just from, and I know as a defense attorney, you do your best for your client, but how does the court look at the defense attorney in a situation like this?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't know if anybody's ever asked me. I have done thousands and thousands of bail arguments. And the one thing that we are obligated to do is we can't lie to the court. We can't create a fraud or keep something from the court. So for instance, if he had any knowledge whatsoever about his client planning to do X, Y, or Z, I mean, at the time that he makes the argument, well, then he would have to have changed how he made his argument in the first place. Does it look bad on the defense attorney? Well, I've walked into court many times where people look at me and decide that I am certain things because of the kind of clients that I represent. I've had a lot of clients. I have cases right now that are murder cases, multiple murder cases, and sometimes I walk into court and I'm dealing with prosecutors and I'm dealing with judges who are looking at me basically assuming that because of the kind of person they think they are, that somehow because of association, that I am equally that person. And regularly, I have to make sure that everybody in the room understands my role. And sometimes I've done that where I've said, Your Honor, let's be clear about my position here. And I've had to do that to judges. And I think I only realize that now, Chris, because I've been doing it so long that I'm regularly in front of judges who I taught how to be lawyers when they were law clerks.
Yeah.
Right. When they were in law school, I was actually teaching them how to do what they do. And so now I'm in front of a whole bunch of judges who I remember when they were like 23 years old. And, and so, I mean, if we're talking about his attorney, Dick, or a lot of the other great lawyers in town and around the country, trust me, we're pretty thick-skinned. We can take that hit all day long because it's what we do.
And he has, Dick DeGuerin, his defense attorney, one of the comments he made was, he's concerned that because this happened, suddenly if this is presented at trial, it looks like consciousness of guilt, he ran because he did it and he's trying to run away from the reality. He argues that his client is just scared. How does that argument potentially look to a jury? Like, how could a jury look at this situation if it's actually presented in court that he fled to Milan, Italy?
It looks bad. I mean, there's a way to shine this up. You can't shine up this turd. You can't. You can't. The fact is that a jury will look at this and they will not like this guy even more. Now, there's a lot of aspects and allegations in this case, including the fact that his wife, Christa, was actually pregnant at the time. That in itself is going to make this jury horrified by this issue. And that's a reality that he and his attorney, Dick, is going to have to deal with. But anytime you also have this fleeing piece, that adds to it. And the prosecution is absolutely preparing to use those bad acts. Remember, you can use, if you can get it in, prior bad acts, things that happen. In fact, there are some documents I've had a chance to take a look at as well in this case, where they're trying to get in that there was a girlfriend on the side and some of the other statements he was making. Mm-hmm. They're going to try to get those in for trial itself. At the same time, post bad acts, those that happen after the charges themselves, you can try to get those in too, because those really reflect guilt. They reflect fleeing, because would an innocent man flee, which is the argument that the prosecution is absolutely going to make. And frankly, Dick already has his hands full with a complaining witness victim, because we're not there yet, who is the dead wife who's pregnant. That has a lot to keep him busy already. So this is just going to add to that.
And then just lastly, like looking at what we know about the evidence in this case, the medical examiner says that Lee Gilley strangled his wife to death. I've read KPRC TV has that Dick DeGuerin, a lot of the defense may be around a pre-existing condition. And the argument that he will make if and when this goes to trial is that she died of a pre-existing condition. As a defense attorney, as a former prosecutor, like, how do you handle a strangulation case like this? What are some of the challenges that they're going to deal with if and when goes to trial?
Well, let's think about the nature of the charge itself and of this alleged pre-existing condition. I mean, one of the struggles that both sides will have is establishing if there was a pre-existing condition. And more importantly, what we do have is we have quite a bit of information. And you're going to see not just the medical examiner coming in and saying, what was the cause of death? What was the condition of the body at the time? I mean, for instance, we talk about strangulation cases. One of the first things that I'm always looking for is something called bilateral retinal hemorrhaging. This is bloodshot eyes, where you basically get something that happens that causes that actual trauma that works itself up into the head. There's actually bones that can break that are actually in the neck, and you're looking for those. And if those are the case, those are all part of it. Is there any other trauma to the area around her back, and that was part of the thing the prosecution was talking about, but also the strangulation piece. So the question is this: what was the condition of the body? Then what you have from the prosecution is you're going to have another expert who's going to come in and talk about pre-existing condition and talk about what a pre-existing condition would be, what it would do to a body, and what it would do to a body that was then assaulted. And so you're going to have both sides of that. Now, at the same time, the defense can look at this case and they can run down a list, and there's about 18, 19 different things that you might see in a strangulation case. And frequently, you don't see very many of those. And you don't need to see very many of those. But you might have 17 or 18 or 19 of those. And if 14 of them are missing, well, I'm going to spend a lot of time establishing that this wasn't a strangulation because I didn't see that hemorrhaging, because you don't necessarily need to see it, but I may use that. And now I can then come back based upon what the prosecution is doing, and I can use my own expert. Part of this is about an expert to expert question. And if there was nobody else in the room, all we have is forensics. All we have is a body. And it's not always as easy as you think.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens. I mean, there was going to be a lot of eyes on this trial when it began prior to Lee Gilley going to Europe. And now a lot of people are going to be keeping an eye out for when he gets back and then how this goes from here. Jack Rice, always great to have you on Law and Crime. Great conversation. Thanks for being here.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.